Hello, welcome everyone to the second instalment of the recently recommenced Adventures in Culture and Technology series, brought to you by our ever capable CAT postgrads, and Katarina and Chan. Last time we got to see Professor John Hartley come up with some interesting stuff on cultural science. This week we've got one of our other prized researchers in the centre, Matt Chrulew, who, as you have seen in the bio, has been doing all kinds of wonderful things recently on questions of animality, most notably being co-editor of the collection The Co and Animals, published by Chrulew last year, and also co-editor of the very recently published Extinction Studies with Columbia University Press. Matt's a DECRA, looking at the question of philosophical ethology, and has been associate editor of, and still is associate editor of Environmental Humanities, and a co-editor of numerous special issues devoted to the question of animal in such luminary journals as Angelaki and Substance. So he's been doing a bit on this kind of stuff. He has personally inspired me to get back to the question of thinking about the environment in relation to contemporary cultural theory, and to that I owe a great deal of thanks. But we're not here to listen to me, we're here to listen to Matt. Who I'll hand over to now, is going to be talking on Heini Hediger and the significance of zoo biology in the Anthropocene.
Thanks, Rob. Hold on. Yes, so, and thanks to Shan and Katarina for organising this latest adventure in culture and technology. I'm the guy who wants to talk about animal culture and about technology, interspecies technologies of power. So I hope that's the adventure you signed up for. And what I want to talk to you about today is my man Heini Hediger and the significance of zoo biology in the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is quite a problematic and loaded term, but one that I'm just using here as shorthand to refer to a number of aspects of our contemporary situation in regards to human relationships to animals and to the environment. Zoo biology and why it might be significant is an interesting question, because when it comes to philosophy of science, it's the physics and chemistry and sciences like that have traditionally been taken as the most significant. Biology itself has had to struggle to articulate its significance, and the philosophy of biology the same. And zoo biology is sort of doubly marginalised because even biologists don't take zoo biology seriously as a science, because it's the science of animals in zoos, who are taken to be artefacts of human culture, to be not real, not wild animals, and so on. So the significance of research and knowledge that emerges from within the zoo is not something that's normally recognised, but it's something that I want to try to think about, not necessarily make too strong a claim for, but to think about in relation to the question of the Anthropocene, which in some definitions is described as in some ways, the zooification of the wild. So the picture of the world in which a world of ever-encroaching humanisation, in which there is no longer any really viable distinction between the zoo and the wild. I don't want to claim that, but that's the space in which zoo biology might start to become and seem significant. Whoops, yes, that's up there, and this is here. Who is Heini Hediger? That is Professor Dr. Hediger, who is a Swiss zoologist and animal psychologist. He was the director of the Bern, Basel and Zurich zoological gardens in succession in the very middle of the 20th century, and he's a very influential zoo biologist, in fact known as the father of the discipline of zoo biology itself. And so part of my argument is that has been that he's a sort of instrumental figure in the sort of biological modernisation, indeed the biopolitical modernisation of zoos into institutions based on a scientific grounding in their care for animals. So I've listed a number of figures that were his teachers and colleagues. Jakob von Uexküll is very important. Uexküll's sort of re-emerged a little in recent theory. Brad Buchanan, my colleague, for example, has written a book on the influence of von Uexküll in contemporary 20th century continental philosophy, figures like Deleuze, Merleau-Ponty and Heidegger. Heidegger was sort of he put Uexküll into practice in a way. So he always started from, Uexküll was a sort of Kantian animal biologist who wanted to talk about the animal worlds, the Umwelt, of an animal as the sort of subjective world that it lives in. And Heidegger always started from the animal's subjective world rather than from the outside trying to talk about it objectively. And so he operationalised Uexküll in a way, in terms of understanding how the animal sees the world and then taking that knowledge and using it in order to better care for or control other species. One of his teachers was the theoretical biologist Adolf Portman. He worked with his successor at Bern, Monica Meyer-Holzapfel, in this sort of process of recognising in zoos the abnormalities. You'll be familiar with the image of a pacing cheetah in the corner of a cage. These sort of stereotype movements, abnormalities, psychiatric problems of zoo inmates were precisely the problem that the 20th century zoo biology faced, and Heidegger and Meyer-Holzapfel were very important in identifying and working to ameliorate these responses to captivity in order to put the care of animals on a healthier footing. He was a colleague and correspondent of Comrade Lorenz, the famous ethologist, but differed in a number of ways from Lorenz's opinions about the sort of innate mechanism of instinct and innate releasing behaviours. He had much more in common with another great friend and correspondent of his, Thomas Seebiok, the American biosemiotician and founder of the field of zoo semiotics, which again starts from the subjective world of the animal rather than objectively. He was also a colleague and sometimes combatant of the German zoobiologist Bernhard Chimik, who was a sort of German David Attenborough in a way, a sort of television personality and publicist of animal lives through documentaries and these sorts of things. Heidegger had a little bit of that sort of ambition as well. He wrote a number of books, including for children, and was on television and gave popularisations of his knowledge and that sort of thing. Didn't quite achieve the same fame as Chimik, but he did. I have to tell you the story. During his tenure as the director of Zurich Zoo, was fired by the zoo board over conflicts over how the zoo should be run. I think someone was profiting off of selling animals or something like that. And so he was fired by the zoo board of Zurich Zoo and subsequently reinstated due to a student protest numbering in the thousands in the streets of Zurich. So he was quite a popular figure with his students. He taught at university there. And so public pressure came via a protest to reinstate the zoo director of Zurich Zoo. And then the board itself was fired and he was able to get on with the job of running it how he saw fit. So I've listed there a number of his most famous books. The first three, Wild Animals in Captivity, Studies of the Psychology and Behaviour of Captive Animals in Zoos and Circuses, and Man, Animal in the Zoo, were all translated relatively quickly after their publication, and these are sort of practical manuals for zookeepers that also delve into philosophy and animal behaviour science. And he's quite an influential figure, especially in the United States, in zoobiology. He wrote a number of other books and dozens of scientific articles. One of the books that hasn't been translated, but I'm very thankful to Anna Katerina for working on translating this over the last few months, and I'm going to be relying on some of that work, is his book, Tiere Verstehen, Understanding Animals, Insights of an Animal Psychologist, which was published quite late in his life, I think it was 72 or something, and gave many of his interesting opinions about animal psychology itself. Okay, so who was he? I keep getting confused. I'm going to show you a quick video of Hediger, the American zoo director and animal psychologist Terry Maple went and visited him and recorded this interview with him, and so I've just got a very short section from it to give you an idea about Hediger's zoo biology. Does anyone know what that bird is? It's an oxpecker sitting on the back of a rhino in Hediger's Africa house.
But we have no idea was, of course, to avoid all the iron bars. I'm convinced that today you can construct whole zoos, birds included, without viral issues and iron bars. And this material should be avoided, in my opinion, because it reminds a prison. But the animals we have now, the birds, all the animals we have now in zoos, really do not feel as prisoners. They feel as ground owners. They consider the room that they have at their disposal as their private property, and they prove it because they mark it also. They put their olfactory marks, the secretions of the different glands, or the birds mark their territory by their song, exactly as they do in nature. And I think this is a sure proof that the animals as subjects really feel as ground and not as prisoners.
Okay, so that's Hediger in Zurich Zoo in front of the Africa House, which is one of his most famous exhibits that he designed. And he writes really interestingly about, you can see it's sort of curved instead of using straight lines, and puts in a number of the principles that he followed in zoobiology, but in particular what he was able to do, which hadn't been done before, was to bring these oxpeckers, which are in symbiotic relationship with the rhinos in their natural environment, and to release them into the exhibit and to watch quite nervously and to be pleasantly find that they in fact went and sat on the back of the rhino just as they otherwise would. And so part of what I want to do to sort of try to more precisely specify what Hediger was about in 20th century zoobiology is to relating to the famous figure of Karl Hagenbeck, who some of you might be familiar with. He was a turn of the 20th century German animal trader and zoo man, as well as a circus man. He was involved in basically collecting animals from Africa and everywhere else around the world, bringing them to Europe and providing them to circuses and zoos and so on, and also inventing new forms of display and exhibition. So this is a quote from his sort of book about his career. A desire above all things, he says, to give the animals the maximum of liberty, which to exhibit them not as captives, confined with narrow spaces and looked at between bars, but as free to wander from place to place. And he goes on, a certain point must be fixed in the garden from which might be seen every kind of animal moving about in apparent freedom and in an environment which bore a close resemblance to its own native haunts. And so Nigel Rothfeld has written really beautifully about Hagenbeck's transformation of the zoo, particularly as an exhibitionary apparatus. So what it's about for Hagenbeck is mostly the point of view of the human viewer. So they need to appear as if they are free, they need to appear as if they're in relation to one another. And what he actually invented was a whole series of architectural and other technologies by which they could give that appearance instead of the bars and so on, by using moats, etc., so that they could appear to be free. Hediger does something different, but related. Hediger is, in a way, completing and also interiorising Hagebeck's project. So this is just the transcript of the interview that we just listened to. And you might have noticed that when Hediger's talking about this, he's talking about it from the animal's point of view. He says, the animals we have now in zoos really do not feel like prisoners. They feel like landowners. So he's wanting to make the claim that he can know, not everything, but enough about what it's like for the animals, and that they can in fact use that knowledge to, instead of transferring the zoo from cages to a garden, as in the case of Hagebeck, to transfer it from a cage to a territory that the animal treats as its own home. So there's this sort of internal psychological process. So if in the case of Hagebeck, the technologies he put in place were sort of physical ones. For example, he would measure the precise limits of the leap of a certain animal. How high can it jump, or how far can it jump? So all we've got to do is make the moat longer than that, longer than these limits, right? So the animal is sort of physically instantiated within the cage. Hediger would do things like have cages that the animal might physically be able to escape from, but just never would due to psychological captivity. So it would not see that as a possibility of escape. So it wasn't always entirely about the physical, but also about the psychological world of the animal. So that's part of what I've been writing about. I'll just quickly mention that as part of this modernisation and scientification, if that's a word, of zoo biology in the 20th century, Hediger was involved in a number of sort of international consultancy projects. He went to national parks in Africa and sort of wrote about how they should set things up from an animal psychological point of view. He established a zoo in Brazil, and he was asked by the New South Wales government to come and provide a report on Taronga in Sydney, which was quite a controversial thing. I think I've mentioned to some of you before some of the hate mail he received from Australians wishing that he would be dumped into the Sydney Harbour and eaten by the sharks that are there apparently, for daring to come over and tell us what to do with our animals.
Was that important?
Sorry. He received this anonymous letters. He was also publicly attacked by the opposition leader on the floor of the New South Wales Parliament for, in part, having been fired by the Zurich Zoo Board earlier, which he very quickly pointed out he was reinstated, and so on. So part of what he did was to come to Taronga and provide a report about that really professionalised the zoo. So he had a look at all the aspects of its functioning. The person in charge was a sort of amateur zoologist and philanthropist who provided a lot of the funding for the zoo, but was also doing things in a way that Hediger didn't find entirely professional or scientific. So thanks to CCAT and the Australian Academy of Humanities, been able to go to the archives in Taronga and in Zurich and look at his materials about this. He provided photos showing the animals not being kept in a good condition, and for example here writes, contrary to the ridiculous theory of Sir Edward, the zoo director, that animals in the Taronga Park Zoo do not die there. It is in fact a considerable mortality according to the zoo's own records, but instead of having made proper post-mortems of the dead animals in order to improve the care for the surviving animals, more than 90% of the carcasses are simply dispatched in an incinerator. So this is part of what I'm talking about in terms of the biopolitical, biological, scientific basis of care for animals that Hediger was wanting to institute.
What date is this?
This is in the 60s. And so this sort of process was going around going on in different zoos around the world as well, and there's been a fair bit written about this sort of transformation of zoos in both appearance and functioning. So in my work so far, which is sort of, there's a number of essays out there, and I'm sort of working on finalising a manuscript. I've sort of taken this approach of a sort of Foucauldian genealogy of zoobiology in terms of the intertwining of power and knowledge over animals within the zoo, and thinking about how that relates to and differs from other sort of sites such as the laboratory, the circus, the wildlife management in national parks, and so on. But a large part of what I'm talking about is that sort of biopolitical modernisation process in which Hediger was a central figure. I don't think I need to go through much of that argument except to say that an important part of what happens in zoobiology is this sort of recognition and isolation of the domain of behaviour, and from there the domains of subjectivity and culture among animals as sites of knowledge, of power and of intervention. We'll talk a bit more about this in a minute, but there's you know, it's not just a matter of the mechanisation or the physiological or biological perspective on animal bodies, but it's precisely whether, as part of their planned research, or whether they were just forced to confront these facts due to their failures of their attempts to have animals reproduce or to live well within their zoos. What zoobiology does is to isolate the domains of behaviour, culture and subjectivity among animals. My argument in the essay in Foucault and Animals, and so you don't have to read it anymore because this is literally the last line, is following Foucault on Kant on the Enlightenment, that the question, one of the questions that we should be asking about animals today is not can they suffer or can they speak, but who are they? Who are animals today? And so zoobiology, I think, helps us to put that into a more concrete example, because it's the question of zoobiology as well. Who are these animals that we're caring for? Are they wild? Are they artefacts? Are they, in what ways are they changed? Are they capable of caring for their own young? Are they capable of surviving in the wild still? And so on. And the different answers to these questions are provided in the course of their various experiments, whether in the zoo or indeed outside of the zoo, as they attempt to reintroduce them to the wild in some cases. So that has been my research, but part of what I'm wanting to do, in particular as part of my DEC project around the philosophy of ecology, is to take a bit of a different approach to the question of the status of the knowledge that zoobiology produces. So Foucault infamously, when speaking about his genealogical method, said that he wanted to bracket the question of the truth value of the knowledge. So he's talking about the ways in which knowledge and power intertwine in different contexts, in medicine or in the psychiatric hospital and so on. And he wasn't really focusing on whether or not a particular discourse is true, but what are its power effects. And that's sort of what I've been doing in a number of these articles. But I think that thinking about the way in which philosophy and the scientific discourse can relate to each other, if philosophy is going to take it upon itself to critique or to historicise or contextualise scientific discourse and practice, then it has to make itself, open itself up to the possibility of being likewise transformed by what that science has got to say. So I don't think that that sort of authoritative relationship is one that a sort of philosophical or cultural theoretical approach to science can take. And so the reciprocal question of how ought my approach to be transformed by what this science is telling me needs to be asked. So that's part of what I'm trying to do. Here is to ask, what has zoobiology learned and what can we learn from zoobiology? So here we are. All right. I'm going to have to move a bit quicker. So part of Hediger has a sort of spotty reception, of course, in zoobiology itself, where he is remembered by different people in different ways, and you'll see in zoobiological journals people encouraging, their younger colleagues to go back and read this great grandfather of the field. One of the places that has actually received him and been prepared to do so is in the field of zoosemiotics, which is a sort of strange to many Anglo-Saxon disciplines, sort of subfield of semiotics and biosemiotics that sees all life as meaningful. Its meaning, its significance all the way down. It's always the transfer of signals that we're wanting to analyse. And so Thomas Seebiok, his colleague, Chrulew, the zoo director of Thailand Zoo, Turovsky, have written about Hediger as a pioneer in non-verbal communication studies. But elsewhere, there's very little. There's one sole article that I found, Environmental Philosophy, which I'll talk a little bit about later. And part of what I'm wanting to do is to ask how might or ought Hediger to be received within contemporary discussions in animal studies and around the question of the Anthropocene. So this is his book, Understanding Animals, which he says, like many animal-titled books these days, has a double meaning. It's both an instruction and invitation to understand animals, but one of the things that we must understand about animals is that they themselves have the ability to understand. And so there's always this reciprocal and reflexive process going on. And so how do we incorporate what animals understand into our understanding of and our relationships to animals? He does us the favour of listing some of his favourite themes that he returns to. I obviously can't talk about all of them, but there's some really interesting stuff in there. He had quite an influence on the notion of proxemics, which is the spatial distances that organisms are happy to have between them. So he would define the flight distances of animals from humans, the point at which they will flee. And this has also been applied sociologically and in architecture with humans and so on. He was fascinated by animal dreaming. So you've ever sat there watching your dog's eyes. He was always doing the same thing, but with his elephants and his other animals in the zoo as well. And in fact, we try to do little experiments on their sleep. And he wanted to do something called systematic starting from animals. So not the systematics of the animal world, but how does an animal systematise the world? What is the systematics of the world according to a particular species? So I'll try to talk about some of the things that he talks about in this book and in a number of sort of back catalogue essays that he has in various journals around the place. One of the things that I find is that he anticipates a lot of the things that are being said today in the field of animal studies and science studies by people like Donna Haraway. So we have this zookeeper, from the 50s through to the 80s, anticipating a lot of the themes of animal studies. For example, a critique of mechanistic ethology. So in Understanding Animals, he's wanting to talk about what animal psychology is and to differentiate it from mechanistic ethology of Lorenz and others, which is to look at the animal objectively from the outside. But he says they don't want to actually understand animals, but only their behavioural mechanisms as if the animals were machines. But for a zoobiologist and animal psychologist, animals cannot be machines but are unique, independent individuals in the sense that they are persons. Animal psychology says deals essentially with subjects, with experiencing, feeling, and to a certain degree empathic and understandable subjects, that is to say, animals. However, ethology treats animals as anonymous objects and doesn't seek to understand them, but to translate them into statistics, etc. I think I could email that passage to Dominique Listel and convince him that he had written it himself. It could have been ripped verbatim from one of his books of the last few years. So this one's in here for John. He had an enormously humorous swing at Dawkins soon after The Selfish Gene was published as a terrible anthropomorphic projection of the language of managerialism and economic active theory onto animals. So he's wanting to weave a path between both over-anthropomorphizing animals but also mechanising them. He wants to understand what animals are for as themselves. And there are both differences and similarities. So the question of the objective observer detached from the things that they're observing is another thing that he picked up on. Some of his passages could have been written by Haraway or a feminist science studies scholar. The human observer, he writes, present themselves as it were naked and in a glass house, all the while believing that they are objectively recording a pure animal behaviour observed from a safe hiding place. And partly because the animals have sensory abilities that outstrip our own in terms of understanding what it is we're doing. So the most famous example of this is the clever hands. The clever hands hypothesis or effect, which sort of comes from a German horse that was taken to be understanding language and the things it was instructed to do by its owner, when in fact it was responding to more subliminal micro movements or expressions of the owner rather than linguistically. And this is sort of generalised as a sort of experimenter effect that happens in psychology and other experiments where the fact that the experimenter thinks that something's going to happen ends up being communicated to the experimental subjects through channels that aren't under investigation, and that's part of the reason why the experiment turns out the way it was. And so Hediger, in his correspondence, would write to people out of the blue and tell them off for all these terrible experimental effects as part of their studies that they weren't aware of. And so part of my question with him is, what does he want? What does he want? So he identifies there are more of these relationships going on between human and animal than people think. Does he want to continue to eliminate them for the better, or does he want to actually recognise them and experiment with them, right? And the answer is a bit of both, depending on the context. Maybe as a general law, he writes that through observation the observed will be altered. And that's sort of a central principle of contemporary animal studies and science studies. It's always a relationship between two living subjects and not between a subject and an object. So in the experimental context, if you wanted to find out what was the effect of the human and what was not, then this is something that should be eliminated. But in a different context, as for example in the zoo or in the circus, he takes a different approach. So I'll get to that in a second. Okay. So part of the question today in animal studies is around empirical knowledge about animals. And so one of the most famous incidents in animal studies is Donna Haraway's criticism of Derrida's work. So Derrida's lecture on the animal is a deconstruction of this sharp dualistic division between human and animal, and indeed of the very concept of animal itself as a sort of a zoo that puts a whole multitude of different things in the one place in a way that doesn't make any sense. And so he argues instead in favour of multiplying our understanding of the differences between animals. One of the things that Haraway argues is that despite his intentions, he's not curious enough and does not take seriously enough the possibility of positive knowledge in relation to philosophical knowledge about these animals. So it's not just a matter of gesturing towards animal difference, but in fact of investigating it. And for Haraway, there are scientists such as Bateson or Goodall, Smuts and others whose positive knowledge of animal life we can see as, in a way, a non-dualistic, post-deconstructive knowledge. And so this is what Haraway argues. And part of what I'd suggest is that Hediger, in many ways, represents a figure who sort of preemptively responds to this debate. He argues for the valuable and singular empirical situation that he finds himself in zoo biology. So Derrida has these lists of different animals and says, how can we put them all under the one thing? Hediger writes of his own background that comparatively few biologists have had the opportunity of living in close contact with animals of all taxonomic ranks that my 35 years as a zoo director have afforded me. I've always considered it a privilege, even a blessing, to be surrounded on a daily basis by such a multiplicity of animals, from unicellular organisms to apes, not only in zoos but during my travels, etc. So he's actually making a very particular claim, not only against laboratory experiments that only deal with certain species of mice and so on, that he actually has, through the accumulation of anecdote and experience, something empirical to offer to claims that are made about animal life. And one of the sort of more speculative ways he does this is in his thinking about animal names. So we're familiar with the practice of naming animals in sort of zoology as a system of classification of animal species, and in the corner there is a frog that was in fact named or renamed after Hediger in the sort of common scientific practice, who did a lot of his early work in herpetology and following sort of collecting voyages to Papua New Guinea and the South Seas and places like that. So this is the sort of the normal zoological practice. But what Hediger wants to ask is not about the human naming of animals, but how animals name things. An animal act of naming, he says, is something he's been pondering for decades. And it is, in fact, he argues, implied by the recognition that ethology has made of the ways in which animal societies are territorial and are organised in social hierarchies and so on, that this means that animals mutually recognise each other as individuals, and that thus they make use of proper names. It's not only widespread, he says, but also presupposes a distinction between the self and the other, and thus a kind of consciousness. But these names are not verbal names such as we use. These names are, he writes, acoustic, ultrasonic, optic, tactile, electric in nature, but also olfactory. So animals recognise a face or a trace of other animals as individuals, and for this, for Hediger, is an example of the proper name for an animal. And he goes like Otto Kohler's work on unnamed thinking and unnamed counting, for example, in human infants as well as in animals. So this sort of speculation, I think, precisely figures into what Derrida is asking for. In his sort of more fabulistic gestures towards the type of philosophy that ought to come, that is not dualistically dividing the human from the animal, or that is not putting all the animals into one spot. He writes, it would not be a matter of giving speech back to animals, but perhaps of acceding to a thinking, however fabulous and chimerical it might be, that thinks the absence of the name and of the word otherwise and as something other than a privation. So in particular, it is language that is supposed to differentiate humans from animals, and that the lack of language in animals is seen as something that they're missing, that means that they are unable to, have a proper relation to the world as a world. For Derrida, we need to work towards thinking this other than as a privation. And I think part of what Hediger's doing when he's thinking about animal names in an olfactory and another sense is to think about what Sevier calls non-verbal communication studies, right? So communication, but not through human language. In that way. So, how am I going for time, boss? Right. I can finish there, or I can finish in 5 to 10 minutes. Okay. All right. So that is an example of the type of knowledge that Heidegger produces in one of his more speculative modes, based on his experience with animals in the zoo and elsewhere. So to get back to, as we talked about earlier, the question of the relationship between the human and animal in the sort of experimental or observer situation where we're wanting to know things about the animal. And so he insists on the unremovability of that human-animal relationship in a knowledge relationship. This is what is supposed to be eliminated in the lab, but he says that it is precisely these relationships between human and animals that are of utmost importance in animal psychology. This question of that relationship, I think, doesn't just have an epistemological frame to it about what can we know of animals. It also has an ontological and political one, in terms of asking not just what can we know, but how can we live with them and how ought we to live with them. And Heidegger, even though he doesn't go there entirely, does gesture towards these sorts of questions as well. To meet the requirements of zoo biology, he writes, there should not be an elimination, there should be an intensification of the animal-man relationship. And much earlier, he said the animal-man relationship should be allowed full play. So he's not arguing for, even though part of what zoos do and part of what he thought they do is to allow captive animals to still be wild, and that is the legitimate goal of what he thought he was doing, was to eliminate the deleterious effects of human captivity and the artefacts of the fact that we've got them in these entirely altered environments. He nonetheless didn't see this as coming about through eliminating the human-animal relationship, but rather through intensifying it. He writes really well about what goes on in animal training in circuses and the sort of tigers leaping onto the backs of trainers and so on. And one of the phrases that he uses there I really like, he really wants there to be established a laboratory circus, right, which is a circus in which what goes on is animal training in order to perform under laboratory conditions in which we can work out how it is that animal trainers get the animals to perform like this. Right? I think that this is actually a more generalisable concept, and one way of thinking about the Anthropocene is that everywhere is in some ways a laboratory circus. It's a site in which we have to think about how we relate to animals and also think about what we know about what they're doing. And so part of his philosophy is that the mutual transformation of human and animal, for example, in the zoo context, isn't something to be avoided. In fact, he sees it as an entirely biological phenomenon. So anthropomorphism is a way in which humans assimilate animals. Zoomorphism is a way in which animals assimilate humans into their societies. And he in fact talks about, at a number of points, what he calls the catalytic effect, which is the fact that animals change as individuals in different anthropogenic contexts in ways that are not witnessed in their own societies. So he talks about the surprising changes and an increase in behaviour that can be caused through the catalytic effect of human beings, which surpass by far the genetically given ethogram of a species. So this is individually acquired. So it's not the sort of acquired behaviour that all animals, all animals of a species will get, but something that an individual has taken on. This is remarkably similar to, the argument of Dominique Listel in his important untranslated book on the singular animal. Certain animals, Listel argues, develop a complex identity within the particular framework of the relationships they develop with humans. The human witnessing the animal's interiority in turn provokes its development and dynamics. what Hediger argues is that through this relationship of the cat, and through this relationship with the animal in which the human catalyses them into becoming something different, that this is the alpha and omega of practically all animal experiments since clever hands. And again, part of what I want to do is to think about how we can expand on Hediger's meaning to refer not only to animal experiments in the laboratory sense, but the sense in which in the Anthropocene the entire world is an animal experiment. And so part of what Hediger does, this is just a quote from that article I mentioned on environmental philosophy, where Cox compares Hediger and Heidegger without any name wordplay. He managed to avoid it in order to argue for a zoocentric phenomenology of wilderness. And so that instead of imagining wilderness as the absence of any relationship, as absence, that we should imagine it positively as composed of the multiple overlapping worlds of animals. So we need to start from the animal point of view. And he correctly identifies that Hediger allows us to do this through his Uxkullian zoosemiotic zoobiology. But what Hediger also does, in addition to allowing us to rethink wilderness, is it allows us to rethink domestication, different forms of domestication. He offers us not only a zoocentric understanding of wilderness, but also a relational one. So wildness is produced through the human-animal relation. Even coming back to his fundamental biological definition of a wild animal is one that runs away from human beings. Right, so it's not one that doesn't have a relationship to or doesn't know what a human being is. It's one that knows very well what a human being is and what one ought to do when one encounters them. So what he enables is, I'm arguing, a multiplication and pluralisation of interspecies encounters beyond the sort of simplistic ideas of domestication, of artifactualisation, and through very precise and empirical distinctions of the multiple forms that human-animal relationships can take, such as tameness, different forms of training, synergic relations, and so on. And what he recognises is different ways in which animals are capable of adapting to anthropogenic environments and responding differently. So, if I was to ask about the significance of zoobiology in the Anthropocene, it's because one way of understanding the Anthropocene is as this acceleration and intensification of human-animal worlds colliding. And this means, in many cases, destruction and extinction of animal worlds. In other cases, it means the catalytic effect and the production of new possibilities for animal worlds. And both of those things are going on. And despite many of the things that one can and that I have criticised about the operation of zoos, it has also been a site for the invention of techniques and practices of interaction between human and animal worlds. And I think Hediger is a really good example of the way in which different types of knowledge and practice are produced in this contact zone. He in fact anticipates and sometimes surpasses much of what is discussed in contemporary animal studies, and in his singularly empirical differentiation of forms of human-animal relationship, he diversifies the texture of animality. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Matt. Very informative, but not informative enough because we've got questions.
So I want to go back to something you mentioned right at the beginning when you were talking about Heidegger creating like almost psychological prisons, I guess it sounds like. So how do you do that?
Through recognition of the different things that made up an animal's world. Part of what he argued was that the animals see their cage as home, right? And so, for example, when a lion or some animal would escape from a zoo, which occasionally would happen, and the public would go into a panic, he would say, "What are you worried about? The only thing it wants to do is go back to its home." And he was, and this would actually often happen. And so this even becomes, in later zoobiology and conservation biology, the concept of a psychological cage becomes objectified as a problem that zoobiologists encounter when they want to reintroduce animals into the wild, because they take them to a national park or something in order to supplement the declining population there. They release the animals and they don't want to go anywhere, right? Because they're comfortable, thank you very much, with having been fed and protected and, you know, by their keepers. So there's this dependence that they develop upon on their caregivers / captors, depending on your perspective.
Would you call that,
Right.
would you call that dependence or territory?
Well, he talked about in terms of territory, but he absolutely recognised that that zoo animals are transformed in that they rely on their keepers for food and for protection from predation. So he in the 70s and 80s, for example, would criticise these ideas that people had that you could get zoo animals and put them back into the jungle because he knew it wasn't going to work. Some zoobiologists forgot this and did it, and in the process worked out, oh crap. But then also we're forced to work out, okay, how can we do this properly? How can we make these animals become capable of once again living in a different environment, their natural environment?
Did he talk about pets? So some of what you've described about this sort of idea of a more intense relationship with animals seems to echo, I think, a lot of what's said around pets and what pet owners say about their animals and how they adapt their homes to try and make tiddles happier and all of that stuff.
Yep. He did. Just as a point of contrast and comparison with the zoo, he would talk about he took more seriously what pet owners would say than laboratory scientists might. He was still very critical of the anthropomorphism that goes on, the way pets are treated like human babies and so on. But at the same time, it wasn't as if he saw it as a corruption of the animal. I don't think that was part of his conceptual vocabulary.
I don't know quite how to put this, but a lot of what we've heard, and I don't know if I to know whether it's a sample or just the way knowledge developed in that area, but it seems to be individualising animals in terms of observation because zoos have individual animals. So did he ever look at animals in groups, like politics, as it were, of adulting in relation to these matters of communication, biosemitic views? Do you know?
Yep. He did, and he also was across the literature that was available as well. He was quite polymathic in that sense. He definitely, so in terms of the relationship between zoobiology and ethology and these other sciences that are looking at animals in their natural habitats, was one of the ethology provides the norm. So how is the animals behaving in the wild is how he wanted to, as close as possible, have his animals behaving in the zoo. And that included things like the types of groups that they formed and didn't form, the points at which the groups changed and so on. So he was one of the pioneers of understanding how species-specific reproductive groups or fights over territory at adolescence and all these sorts of things were what had to be taken account of by a zookeeper, and they're very specific to different species, and that if you don't do it, you're going to have animals dying, animals harmed, and so on.
Did he incorporate that understanding into his discussions of animal signification, animal language, animal communication? Because what you put up there was all about olfactory and other markers, as it were, of the individual animal.
Yep. Yeah. So the group divisions. So he would talk about the way an animal would distinguish between enemies and friends, among conspecifics as well as among different species. And that had a lot to do, so they were capable of overlapping with territory with some, whereas others where the border has to occur. So yes, absolutely.
And did you bring that insight to what you wanted to say about human animal relations, that group to group rather than individual to individual?
I'd say that he was really only gesturing towards the need for what's called like zooanthropology today. So yes, he would systematically talk about, the really interesting question is what is the significance of man to the animal? And he'd go through and say an animal can treat a human being as an enemy, or as a friend, or as a symbiote, or as just a dead thing, or as a conspecific. But he'd also want to ask the question of what is the significance of animals to humans? And so that's sort of animal studies, that's its question. He didn't get it very far, and he didn't have the ability of an ethnozoologist or someone like that in order to look at cultural differences and so on. But that he isolated that as the problematic that needed to be investigated. Yeah.
And one final bit to it, what do you think about animals? Because I didn't see any mosquitoes there.
Right. Yes. Huh?
There was one of those quite said unicellular.
Yep.
Oh, he does do that, does he?
Yeah, and he talks about experiments with planaria and things like that. But part of what he did indicate was that what he's talking about when he talks about the significance of the human-animal relationship, for example, with pets and with animals in zoos and circuses, is that he's talking about the higher animals more often. But this sort of recognition of different cognitive abilities among different animals is actually significant, that you can relate to a dog in a different way than you can relate to a snake or another animal, and that actually matters. Probably both. That's always the answer. What do I mean?
Yeah. Well, what should be meant? I mean, you said you were kind of careful about it.
Yeah.
You didn't say what you should be thinking.
Well, yeah. The part of the definition I'm working with is that one of. What did I say? I told you what I meant by Anthropocene. The acceleration and intensification of the mutual interpenetration and transformation of animal and human worlds. And that includes the anthropogenic transformation of animal worlds. So the ways in which their natural environment is, cut through by roads or polluted and so on. I don't know how useful a term it is. I don't think it's actually that useful, but except for its usefulness to just indicate that major question of climate change, of the sixth mass extinction event, which we are responsible for as a species, or as a political economy, or as a, however you want to debate it. But also,
Well, the thing is that the Anthropocene in that context is always negative, isn't it?
Yes.
It's a bad thing we did.
Right.
So it's a kind of Christian morality.
Exactly. There's full narratives, declensionist narratives of inevitable apocalypse, and that's absolutely what I'm trying to argue against. And Hediger is as well, is the idea that all humanization is corruption. That in fact there are part of what he gestures towards is the multiplication of different forms of human-animal relationship.
So is he more like Malansky, as it were, thought changes nature as a geological era or something like that?
Whether it's thought that does, or whether it's things that have been produced by human culture, having fundamental transformative effects on not only animal bodies but animal cultures, and often this is destructive, and it also has the capacity to be inventive, to produce new things. Yeah. There's time for more pie.
No, I was just going to follow up on that because I don't remember from what I've translated that he ever did, but did he actually talk about, questions like habitat loss in the wild or environmental destruction?
A little.
Yeah.
He recognised it as an emerging problem, and this is part of his arguments for the necessity of a zoo, is that urban people need contact with nature and non-human animals, and this is the way in which we can provide it in a context where this destruction and this transformation in the ways that people access the non-human is going on. So that was more the context, yeah.
Yeah, less a question than just something that occurred to me, and perhaps a problem that needs to be solved. I'm sure I've mentioned it to you before, but T.S. Eliot poem, Effie and Ineffable, that was Cat's three names. Where the first name is the name that the humans give it, the owner gives it. Second name is the name that the cats give each other and call each other, and the third one is the cat's own name that is Effie and Ineffable, so on. So it's just in relation to the question of the proper name, and obviously the properness of the proper name is like part of what defines singularity, singularity of the being. But I'm wondering about and the way that was tied into olfactory, electrical, whatever, all these kinds of markers. I'm wondering about just the question of naming more generally, where one of the kind of fundamentals of, let's just call it language, not understood in terms of speech, but that much broader kind of semiotic sense is a kind of fundamental differentiality of the sign, such that the sign can be misunderstood. I'm just wondering in relation to the question of the proper name, particularly when talked about in those sorts of terms of olfactory markers and so on, where there is that prevailing sense of these as causal properties that are direct, this biological process or whatever produces a specific effect that is determined and so forth. I'm just wondering about how the question of naming there might be some kind of conflict.
Heidegger doesn't take that latter position. So for him, it's not a causal. When you talk about the olfactory or the chemical communication between animals, it's not causal. It's the interpretation of signals. So it's always hermeneutics. So it's a naturalised hermeneutics, but naturalised doesn't mean what it would used to mean in that context.
So animals could call other animals by the wrong name?
Yes. But the part of the question of the Anthropocene is the specificity of the anthropos in there, and the whether there are differences in kind in the types of transformation. If all of nature is mutually transformative, are there differences in kind in the type of transformation that occurs as a result of human activity? So that's part of what the Anthropocene question is, and perhaps we're better at, or we're more prone to mistake names, but we're also better at manipulating signals in order to cause others to mistake names. And so part of the argument might be that that's one of our skills through hunting and different types of lures and so on, is to trick animals into mistaking the identification of a prey and a hook or whatever. So that there are differences and different differences that are going on in those entanglements.
Do you have any other questions for Matt?
Thought it was
So,
free.
in terms of, obviously Heidegger didn't like the way that zoos were treating animals, but what did he seemed to find that the practice of capturing animals and zoos and things like that, as long as it was done in a way which subjectifies the animal, or is it more, if we're going to do this, we need to do it correctly?
Yeah, a bit of both. Yeah, so he tells a story in this autobiographical essay about how he's on these collecting missions, and so I can't remember what the species it was, some sort of reptile, and he's collected it, he's got it in a jar or something, and there comes to the point where he's supposed to pour in the liquid to turn it into a artifact, and he couldn't do it. And so this is sort of he decided, I'm not a dead animals guy, I'm a living animals guy. And this is part of what the specificity of the biopower is. Like, he kills things all the time, right? He kills all the bloody mice that are getting into, rats that are getting into his cages, exhibits, the animals that he feeds to the other animals, and so on. So there's absolutely death involved, but he distinguishes it as a practice of care for life, at least for his wards.
So the life that he determines meaningful versus the life that needs to be sacrificed in order for the other life to flourish. Cool.
See, for example, my article in the book, Animal Death.
I have a follow-up to that, if you don't mind. It's to do with mediation of knowledge. Because what you're describing is that he refuses at the point of using death for knowledge, the specimen, as opposed to death for whatever it is that goes on in the zoo. So you have to kill mice, but you can keep them, whatever it is. So he makes that distinction. What was his view of the mediation of animal knowledge in the 20th century, like, the David Attenborough side of things, but also zoo photography, which is one of the more revealing ways, or wildlife photography, one of the more revealing ways to know animals without being in zoos. Was he up there in that mediation practice or not?
I don't know that he commented much on that at all.
Perhaps it wasn't big enough in those days.
Yeah, I think whether he... Yes, he may well have, but I'm not sure that I can think of it at the moment. But it is another avenue. I think he still thinks that there's something essential to the contact, the being in the same place, and that sort of relationship. There's also, there's a rarely talked about distinction between the relationship that the zoo animal has with the audience, which is sort of anonymous, and then the relationship that the zoo animal has with its keeper, which is very particular and individualised, and is sort of part of the theatre of the zoo is to hide the amount of training that goes on in that relationship in order to present the animal as more wild and so on. Yes, I'm sure. I don't know.
So do you think he sort of identified with the circus trainers? Is that sort of...
Yeah, absolutely. He identified with Noah. But yes, the circus training was, and the comparison between circus training and zoo training was something that he investigated and something that he wasn't embarrassed by. That he thought circus training was something really revealing that not enough people had actually scientifically studied what goes on there.
But he didn't think that about pets. I think this is, so he sort of started as a reformed biologist.
Yeah.
And he's interested in these kind of industrial uses of big, impressed animals. But dog training and...
It wasn't really his issue. It wasn't really, because I don't think he's so fussed with dogs when he's got, sea lions and tigers. Yeah. I love my dog.
But if you had access to sea lions and tigers...
Unless there are any more questions that are actually on the topic of zoo animals, I will not have a bar of any domestic animals.
So I should have had a picture.
If not, perhaps you can join me in thanking Matt again for a fabulous presentation.